Hi, everyone. This is Dory Clark with our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. And our guest this week is author Sally Helgesen. Sally is the author of the new book, Rising Together. Sally, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Dory. Wonderful to be with you.
Excellent. Well, Sally, one of the crucial things about you and your background, there's lots of people who do women's leadership, inclusive leadership. You have been doing this a really long time. You had a book that came out and really made a lot of waves back in 1995, Building a Web of Inclusion. And so I'd actually love to just start with kind of a 30,000-foot view. For someone who's been doing this work for 2, 3 decades, what are the changes that you've seen in terms of the overall discourse about diversity and inclusion?
Well, it's interesting, Dory, because with the Web of Inclusion, which came out in 1995, kind of a follow-on to the Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, which came out in 1990 and started this whole thing off. Back in 1995, when Web of Inclusion came out, and it was the first time of using that word inclusion in a workplace context, there was no linkage of diversity and inclusion. Those had not been combined yet. And in fact, the way I thought of inclusion was a good model given the change in the nature of the technologies that we were working with, that they were much more networked. So we needed a different sort of structural model for organizations that would take advantage of that rather than being hierarchical. So I was going along that path of inclusion. It got a lot of attention and the language got picked up, certainly. But it was a few years later that there was this idea of diversity and inclusion, and they got paired, and we began to talk about D&I, DEI. The pairing makes sense. It makes sense primarily because people who are outside the leadership mainstream are more likely to feel that they are not a part of, that they are not included. So the way I describe it is diversity is the reality of the workforce today, wildly diverse, and this is true globally, but inclusion is the set of practices required to lead and manage that diverse workforce.
I think that's a really great point, Sally. Thank you for that. So I want to dive into some of the meat of what you talk about in the new book, Rising Together, which I thought was really interesting and smart. One of the things that you raise, which a lot of people talk about, just when you hear about what women are like, people often say there's sort of this view in the air that women are hesitant to put themselves forward, that women, you offer them a promotion, you even give them an opportunity, but often they step back, they demur, they say, oh, I'm not ready for that yet, or they hesitate to put themselves out there in the same way. I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about that and what's actually going on there?
Well, certainly, and it's very important. And one of the things I always try to do in my book is, in my books, is make clear that in order to talk about things, we often have to talk in terms of generalities, and there are so many exceptions to every rule. But in general, what I have found is that women are often reluctant to claim their achievements. They're a little bit uncomfortable with having too much visibility. Now, this is often the result of experiences. They've gotten a lot of pushback over the course of their career. I remember going to a big event once, and the women had so much trouble articulating what their own achievements were. And right above the women's event was a big sign that said, "There is no I in team." Well, that's fine, but these women were really struggling with the I of any kind. So sending that message was a little confusing. So, and you know what? This is common, not so much the not going for the promotion, but it is common among almost anyone who feels that they stand outside the leadership mainstream. They haven't had the support. They haven't had the visibility. They may have gotten criticism or pushback. So the issue is that we then revert to certain habits or behaviors. We are triggered by our experiences. And these habits and behaviors end up not serving us and really not serving anyone that well. So that's what I'm really trying to look at. Both looked at it in How Women Rise, which is about the habits and behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful people, but also in Rising Together, which is about bridging divides of all kinds so that we can be better supporters with people we feel we may perceive as different from ourselves.
That's great. Thank you. This is Newsweek's weekly interview show, Better. I'm Dory Clark. You can learn more, sign up for updates at doryclark.com. And we're here with this week's guest, which is Sally Helgesen. You can learn more about Sally at her website, sallyhelgesen.com. The new book is Rising Together. And Sally, something that I'm curious about in terms of a topic that you talk about in the book, and something that I think comes up for a lot of people, you were just alluding to it, is people feeling triggered. And I know one of the topics that you dive into is when people are triggered by other folks that they perceive as being better at self-promotion than they are. And so can you talk a little bit about why this is happening and what you can do if you are someone who experiences this and feels kind of frustrated and kind of angry when other people seem to be, in their estimation, promoting themselves too much?
Exactly. And visibility is a big trigger, and it can operate it's very commonly operates when we feel that someone else is better at gaining visibility, at positioning themselves, at talking about their achievements and what they've contributed than we are. And that's fine. The problem is if we allow that trigger to operate in us, if we tell ourselves a story rather than just saying, oh, well, that's interesting, I'm triggered by that person's ability to gain notice. What might I be able to learn from them, even if I don't want to do it like they do it? Instead, we tell ourselves a story. Well, I'm not a showboat like this person. I'm not full of myself like that jerk down the hall. I have heard people say this to me for 35 years in reference to a colleague or coworker. So the problem is then we get dug into that narrative. It's a very self-serving narrative. We happen to be a better person than that other person, rather than thinking, okay, maybe there's something I can learn from this person. They are talking about, oh, I had the client eating out of my hand. Maybe we need to say things like, I really bonded with this client, and I think it was to the advantage of our entire team. So we want to find a way of articulating what we're good at, in this case, becoming more visible, that doesn't fall into this narrative, our usual story, because that is going to keep us stuck. The thing is, Dory, there is no path forward if we're deciding that our colleague is a jerk and full of it. There's no path forward for us other than grabbing someone else we think might be sympathetic and complaining to them. It's a very sterile path.
Yeah, that's an important observation. One of the things that a lot of women leaders experience sometimes is feeling not properly seen or respected by male colleagues. And in your book, Rising Together, you tell a story about a mutual friend of ours, Colonel Diane Ryan, who literally experienced this in a very clear and obvious way. She, as a colonel in the Army, for people who are not in the Army, the thing to do, if you see a superior officer, you are supposed to salute that person. And an experience that Diane recounts is that frequently there would be male officers that were more junior to her, and they would literally pretend not to see her so that they did not have to salute her. Now, this is a fairly obvious and glaring manifestation of an experience that probably a lot of female professionals experience in less pronounced ways. You write about what Diane did, and I thought that was a really interesting and emblematic story. Can you share a little bit more about that, what she did and why it was effective?
That story about Diane Ryan is one of my favorite stories in the book, Rising Together. What was interesting is that she decided, she believed that most of the junior officers who were passing her by, who were pretending not to see her, who were pretending to do something else, she believed that they were not acknowledging her because they probably were uncomfortable acknowledging that a woman was their superior officer, that a woman held a higher status than they did. So that was her sort of story to herself, but she did not act on that story. She put that story aside. She thought, okay, maybe true, but I am going to give this guy who's just passed me and disrespected me the benefit of the doubt and say to him, hello, maybe you did not see me. And give, oh, I'm sorry, I missed you. No, I didn't see you, whatever. Giving him a kind of an out, but holding him to account. You're not letting him pass by and think what a jerk that guy is. No, you're holding him to account. You're saying, I'm here. Your job is to salute me. I'm not going to let this pass, but say it in a way that doesn't presume that you know what motivated it, even if you think you do. And one of the reasons I think this story is so powerful, and this helps us understand when we rewrite a script to tell ourselves a story that will give us a better path forward. In this case, her better path was holding whoever it was to account. This happened over and over again. Hold them to account for noticing them. When we do that, it doesn't really matter if we believe the script, the new story we're telling ourselves. It doesn't matter if we don't think that that's actually what happened. Acting on it, again, gives us a path forward. In this case, it allowed her to assert her position, assert essentially her authority, gain acknowledgement from it in a way that didn't completely humiliate the person who was passing her by.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful insight, Sally, that, even if we're pretty sure that we know what their motivations are, what matters is that we are talking about behavior and we're able to give them an opportunity to step up and actually be more of the kind of person that they should be. So I think that's really interesting. Speaking of people being the kind of people we wish that more people would be like, you have nominated 2 leaders as the Better Leaders of the Week. Now, these are 2 women who work at Kraft Heinz, and I'd love to hear a little bit more. If you could tell us about these leaders and why you nominated them.
Yes, Dominique and Stacy, fantastic, the job they've done. Dory, I've been doing women's leadership initiatives all around the world for 35 years. 35 years. And I think that what Dominique and Stacy have put together is the most effective intensive leadership development program for identified high potential women, in this case at Kraft Heinz, that I have ever seen. It's very, very serious. It takes leadership seriously. It is extremely focused on the how as opposed to the whys. We tend to get stuck in the why this is important, why this matters, what the business case is. Okay, fine. Felice Schwartz made the business case 30 years ago. It's time to move on from that. It's about the hows. And what Dominique and Stacy have put together is very much about, it's very house-centric. And I think it's remarkably effective. And I know the kind of results they've had in terms of having more and more women move into a range of leadership positions at Kraft Heinz, and that is all around the world.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Sally. And three cheers to our better leaders of the week, Dominique Bolden and Stacy Johnson from Kraft Heinz. So thank you. That's fantastic. Now, going back to your book, Sally, Rising Together, one of the stories that you told that I thought was really interesting was about an exchange that you had early in your career when you spoke up at a meeting as a junior employee. You were essentially chastised by a senior leader named Fred, but that exchange proved to be valuable in a different way than you may have anticipated. Can you talk a little bit about that and what lessons you extracted from that experience?
Certainly. I think one of the things when we're outsiders, again, to the leadership mainstream, we often spend a lot of time trying to manage other people's perceptions of us, which is something ultimately we cannot control. And my lesson in this came indeed when Fred, who was my boss's boss, after a meeting in which I was the only woman and the most junior person in the room, I had spoken up and shared an idea that I thought would be useful for people. It was received in silence. That was fine. But as I was going out of the room, Fred came up behind me and said, "Well, you're certainly not afraid to say what you think," in the most condescending possible way. And I thought, okay, I'm cooked here. My boss's boss thinks I'm a complete jerk. But I don't know why I didn't respond either, well, I have a perfect right to say what I think, or I didn't respond, oh, I'm so sorry, please forgive me, Your Highness. I didn't go to either of those typical poles. I just said, no, I'm not. Not defensively, just setting the record straight. No, I'm not. And it was interesting because then he sort of stalked off essentially. But about 2 months later, I overheard him speaking to a colleague. And what he said to her was, you know what I like about Sally? She's not afraid to say what she thinks. And what that taught me was that it's better to not try to manage people's perceptions. Because what happened there was he got used to me. He got accustomed to me. He'd been in a couple more meetings with me. So he changed his opinion without my trying to either change his opinion, fight with him about what his opinion was, or step back and decide, I never should have spoken up. That's the last time I will ever do that. So very, very important lesson for anybody who spends time trying to manage other people's perceptions. It lies outside of our circle of control. So we have no reason to let it into our circle of concern.
Excellent. We're here with Sally Helgesen. You can learn more about Sally and her work at her website. It's sallyhelgesen.com. Her new book is Rising Together. So, Sally, this is fantastic. What you're talking about kind of leads into a question that you hear a lot about these days when it comes to diversity and inclusion and how people, especially non-traditional leaders, fit into the workplace, which is the question, the fraught question of authenticity. You have some thoughts about this and how we should think about being authentic at work. Can you share your perspective?
Certainly. Dory, one thing I've noticed in my own coaching work or when I do workshops in organizations, when I talk about this technique of sort of rewriting the script of what we think is happening in order to give ourselves a path forward, some people always object. They say, I don't want to be fake. I believe that it's important to be authentic and to speak my truth. And what I began to realize is there's a lot of emphasis on authenticity these days, which of course is good. It takes a lot of energy to try to be something we are not. And many people in the workplace in years past had to spend a lot of energy doing precisely that. But when we become too invested in acting authentically at every single moment. When we become too invested with what our colleague Marshall Goldsmith calls an excessive need to be me, we can undercut ourselves. So I believe that it is always helpful to think about balancing authenticity with showing up as a professional and being able to rewrite a script to help us move forward, and if necessary, give others the benefit of our goodwill, as Diane Ryan did. That is a very, very professional path to take. It supports our own capacity to reach our full potential and exert our own leadership talents. So I think getting too caught in this authenticity trap is probably not helpful for many of us if it holds us back from acting more effectively.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. Sally Helgesen, author of Rising Together. Now, Sally, as we're moving into the denouement of our interview here, a question that I have for you. There's a reason, of course, your book is called Rising Together, which is it is focused on what everyone can do to create a more inclusive workplace. If someone is watching this who is a male leader, a male ally, what is your advice to them about a step or steps that they can take to hopefully move the discourse forward and move the results forward so that it is, in fact, a more inclusive workplace?
You know, there are dozens of steps in the book, but one of the things I think that I have noticed men do with great effectiveness is when a woman is talked over in a meeting, or when a woman says something in a meeting and no one notices, and maybe one of the men in the meeting says pretty much the same thing a little later, and everybody goes, "Oh, what a great idea." Men can benefit inordinately by just saying, "Yeah, isn't that what Jen said?" Or, "Yeah, I heard Dory say the same thing at the beginning of the meeting." And you know, I once worked with a fellow who was at a very large company, and he said, "I did that in a meeting once." He said, "And I felt like every single woman in our 70,000 person workforce had heard that story." This is globally, 20 within the first 24 hours. So it's a very effective thing to do. It's a beautiful way of showing support, doing it in a very nice way. It's not like, "Well, she made that point." Of course, no danger there. Just, that's what Dory said, you might recall. But doing that, it also just brands a man very publicly as a champion, an ally, a supporter of women, and someone who has their radar operating so they can notice what women contribute. It's a very powerful thing to do.
That's phenomenal, and it seems very doable. This is Dory Clark. This is our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better, and we have been talking with Sally Helgesen. She's the author of the new book, Rising Together, and you can learn more about Sally and all of her work at her website, sallyhelgesen.com. Sally, thank you so much for being here and joining us.
Oh, just love talking with you, Dory.
Thank you all, and see you next week.